The next topic is compliance and interoperability in an application-centric world. Paul Grun, I guess, will be the speaker. He's been working closely, I know because I'm on the calls, with Dr. Bob Russell from UNH and Paul Bowden from Intel, who also is co-chair of the Interoperability Working Group. So they're doing some really interesting work to find out what the relationship might be between some of the work being done within OFIWIG and some new work that may need to be kicked off within the Interop community. So with that.
Thanks. Yeah, I did want to acknowledge my co-conspirators here. The only difference between me and them is I'm not quite as skilled at stepping back quickly when it comes time to deciding who has to speak. So I got tagged, but Paul is sitting right here and Dr. Russell is in the back. Paul's role, to be clear about this, is he's serving as the chair of the OFA's Interoperability Working Group, which seems to be a good place to take up a discussion like this. The discussion emerged, you'll see throughout the slides that it talks about OFI this and OFI that, and it really has not much to do with OFI. It has more to do with expanding the service that the OFA can deliver to the community as a whole. And it happened to have been stimulated by some thoughts that I had in the process of chasing this OFI rabbit down the hole. So that's kind of where we are. I shouldn't have really called this the OpenFabrics Alliance perspective. I really should have called this just the motivation slide, which is what it is. That the Interoperability Working Group is really a service that the OpenFabrics Alliance provides to its community. You know, the idea is, well, you know, we've got all these great APIs and this great OpenFabrics software. What can we build around that infrastructure that brings more value to the OpenFabrics Alliance community at large? And in the next slide, I'm going to tell you what I mean by community, because it's kind of significant. So one of the ways that the OpenFabrics Alliance settled on to bring additional value to the community was through this interoperability program, which really has these two, these two key goals that are described here below. One was originally, when you think back to the formation of OpenIB, it was to assure the consumer community, those who were considering on the fence, you know, whether I should adopt this new InfiniBand thing or not. But the goal was to assure them that, in fact, there is, in fact, a valid ecosystem of interoperable components that they could rely on in order to make purchasing decisions going forward. That was one goal. The other was to support the vendors who at the time were a passel of relatively small vendors who were entering a new market, to support them in developing ways to deploy their software to be sure that what they had worked and that it worked well. So there were these two complementary goals, if you will. And then the thing that emerged for me was the emergence of this OpenFabrics interface project caused me to kind of rethink if the general approach towards interoperability testing, you know, you take an HCA from one vendor, an HCA from another vendor, cables and switches from other vendor, and you put them in the pot, stir them, and make sure they still work. But because of the OpenFabrics Interfaces project, which is, you know, transport agnostic, so to speak, I began to ask myself if interoperability was really the right way to go forward. So we started exploring that, and that's what you're seeing here today is sort of the outcome of that early exploration. So the question really is there a way that we want to talk about expanding the Interop program that we have today to add more value to the end user community and leverage the fact that we're expanding beyond just the wires that we support today? So I told you I would try to define who comprises the OpenFabrics Alliance community. This is one of those things that gets said a lot, sort of in passing, but I don't think people kind of really get that in their heads, who it is that the OpenFabrics Alliance actually supports. So let me be really specific about it. Let me start from the bottom and work my way up, because I think it goes from really obvious to maybe less obvious as we go up here, which is what I'm referring to when I say historical and emerging. But at the bottom are the vendors. I mean, that is what is driving the OpenFabrics Alliance today, the hardware vendors, you know, who have products in this space that they would like to see adopted by what I'll call roughly the rest of the community, if you will. Next up is the people who, let me read this because I'll get it right, buy, deploy, use, or maintain systems that include networks. So I'm trying to be as inclusive here as I possibly can. The labs is a really good example of that. Anybody in the financial services industry, really good example of that. Anybody who builds and uses systems, those are people who should be, if they are not already, part of the OpenFabrics Alliance community. Next is those who sell systems to those customers, like the OEMs, the VARs, things like that, the Crays of the world for which I work, the IBMs, the large system integrators and vendors. And then above that, the one that I think is sort of a hidden community, but it's becoming more vocal in the OpenFabrics Alliance in the past couple of years, are those who develop code that actually consumes network services. So we've made a concerted effort in the not too distant past, and you see it all over the OpenFabrics Interfaces project, to really engage the people who are going to have to write code that's going to use these APIs that we're developing, to try to get a sense from them about what these APIs really need to deliver. This is this notion of application centricity that we talk about a lot. So those four sort of large categories, I hope, have been inclusive enough to include everybody who should be, if they're not already, part of the OpenFabrics Alliance community. Interesting observation that occurred to me the other day anyway, at least I thought it was interesting, was that I think the OpenFabrics Alliance may be one of the few places in the world where the consumers of network services intersect with those who provide network services, where we can talk about what the requirements for network services are and then how we're going to deliver them. Just kind of interesting to me anyway, side observation about one of the unique values that the OpenFabrics Alliance brings. And that became really obvious last week in this conversation that we had at the Linux Collaboration Summit, where people kept saying, well, it's the vendors, it's the vendors, it's the vendors. And we kept standing up saying, no, the vendors are really important. Those who use this code are more important, or at least as important. I said that there was going to be a lot of OFI sprinkled through this, so let me just do the obligatory OFI, OpenFabrics Interfaces slide here. OFI as a project emerged in 2013, August 2013, and the focus specifically was the transport independence part of it, and that, it turns out, is what drove my thinking about whether interoperability is the right approach for the OpenFabrics Alliance IWG program going forward. And you'll see why in just a minute. I'm going to try to convince you that that turns out to be the case. Just by way of background, and again, I think this has been said before, that the OFI is an umbrella. It's a project that consists of what's planned to be or expected to be or anticipated or envisioned or whatever word you like, to be a family of APIs. We have one right now, which is libfabric. We're talking about whether there's need for a desire to do a second, which would be kfabric, and there's opportunities for others. If other interested communities come forward and say, we need an API built around this framework that suits some particular user community. For example, I don't know, data analysis comes to mind to me, or big data. Some of those are possible future API library sources. So the question really becomes, how do we take all this idea that the OFA is expanding its goal, its role, its view, to really try to bring more value to the community, which is, again, what's driving my thought here. This is today's Interop program. It really is called an Interop program. It's built around vendor testing, so vendors get together at the University of New Hampshire, the Interoperability Lab, and they have these, what they call a Franken cluster, which has one of everything and maybe two of some things. You can run anything you want against any other combination of anything you want. And there's a sort of lengthy process that you go through to validate whether this HCA can talk to that HCA and whether it works with this switch and that cable. It's very hardware-centric, at least the way I see it. Very hardware-centric, driven by, do these products really interoperate in the way that they should? Consists of really two major programs. There's a debug program where people get together in sort of a neutral third-party territory, and they have the opportunity to talk as technical colleagues about, here's why my HCA does this and yours should do that, that kind of thing. And then there's a logo program, which is the official seal of approval that your product really is an interoperable product in the way that the OFA defines interoperability. That's today. I wanted to raise the distinction between this notion of compliance and interoperability. What I was just describing was interoperability. The one thing that we don't do in the OpenFabrics Alliance is compliance testing, or maybe I should say we mostly don't do it. Generally speaking, compliance, which means does your device conform to some sort of a specification somewhere? that generally falls in the realm of the owner of that specification. Good example, the InfiniBand spec. So there's nothing in the OpenFabrics Alliance world that says we stamp your product as being compliant with the InfiniBand spec. That's left to the InfiniBand Trade Association, which owns the specifications for InfiniBand. So a vendor can go to the InfiniBand Trade Association and get some kind of a seal of approval that says that your device complies with this specification. We don't do that in the OpenFabrics Alliance, at least up to now. This is about what I'm about to propose, that we think about this a little bit differently. Anything important in the buzz line there? Yeah. Let me give you an example of how interoperability works today and why interoperability has been the focus of the OpenFabrics Alliance, at least up to now. In the case of the OpenFabrics Alliance, it was formed because we had a number of vendors in the beginning, all trying to implement hardware products to a given specific specification that resulted in an on-the-wire observable behavior to which those two vendors were expected to interoperate. So you had multiple vendors for each component type. In an environment like this, it made a lot of sense to talk about interoperability. So a customer should be able to go buy a Mellanox HCA or a QLogic HCA, or, well, it was QLogic at the time, so I said that on purpose, and ensure that they interoperated. It gave people confidence that there was a strong ecosystem that they could use going forward. But again, there was no notion of compliance. It was sort of implied because if the two HCAs work together, they must both comply with the spec, but it was really about interoperability, not about compliance. In the meantime, the OFA has grown up a little bit. It now supports 3-wire protocols. We've heard this said before, but to recap, there's InfiniBand, there's iWarp, and there's Rocky. 3 separate wire protocols. That is all that's supported by, at least officially, by the OpenFabrics Alliance today. There have been ports to OpenFabrics software to other wires. For example, there's a rapid I/O implementation, things like that. But generally speaking, the idea was you had multiple vendors all serving a limited market for a small number of wire protocols. Interoperability testing makes a lot of sense in an environment like that. So who's the beneficiary from the current Interop program? This is arguable, but I submit that the main beneficiary today is the hardware vendors, those who build and develop products for sale into the marketplace, whether it's iWarp, Rocky, or InfiniBand. Those who buy, deploy, use, or maintain systems still get some benefit because there's something to be said for knowing that the device, has been tested and works in a reasonable way in the context of an interoperability program. Those who sell systems that include networks like OEMs and VARs, generally we hear them saying, we don't care much about this because we're going to rely on the hardware vendor that we use to source the components for the systems that we integrate. So you talk to a system integrator and they'll say, well, Mellanox tells me that their device works and it's certified and that's good enough for me. So they don't get any real direct benefit from it. It's sort of a follow-on benefit, if you will. But the people who don't seem to get much benefit at all are the developers of code that accesses network services. They're not really part of this interop testing. The testing is driven by synthetic code, if you will, test cases, if you will, none of which represents the way that code is actually used by real applications in the real world. So those are the main beneficiaries, the way things stand today in the interop program. And this is a great system. It's working really well for us. But again, the environment may be shifting under our feet a little bit. So let me expand that and talk a little bit about what that would look like in the OFI case. And again, OFI is just a nice stalking horse to use to say, should we be expanding what we're doing today? So I've just replicated that interop stack that I showed a minute ago on the left-hand side just for comparison purposes, and then showed on the right-hand side sort of the corresponding OpenFabrics version where you have this notion of a libfabric framework where you have a number of providers that plug into it. This is where the notion of transport agnosticity becomes important, because no longer is there an assumption that every provider is expected to or even wants to interoperate with every other provider. So I'm a provider, I'm going to develop an OFI-based provider that services wire A, because that's where I think my market is. And I'm going to be some other provider, my other hand here, that wants to service some other wire because I think that's where my market is. And you saw that in Sean's slide with the fairly large array of providers that are already available for OpenFabrics today. There's no notion that an InfiniBand wire would interoperate with Genie, for example. So the notion of interoperability in the OpenFabrics interfaces world no longer really makes a lot of sense. There's really no point in talking about two providers that interoperate with each other unless there were two vendors that both developed a provider for a specific wire, and they got together and decided they both wanted to serve that market and they wanted to test their products together. I suppose you could see that happening. But right now, what we're looking at is 5 or 6 or 8 totally distinct wires where there's no notion of interoperability. That's what the little red X between the wires connecting the switches is intended to imply. The other point about this is that the interface, we've said a number of times, is abstracted from the wire. Again, in the traditional sort of stack that we're used to working with, it's driven by verbs, which is based on the InfiniBand specification, which is built around the notion of Q pairs, and the wires all deliver that same kind of architecture. OFI is going about this differently. That doesn't really impact this interoperability compliance argument I'm making, but it's true nonetheless. So compliance. The goal now shifts to being away from being do two vendors talk well together to does a vendor deliver to the application, again this notion of application centricity, does it deliver to the application the features and functions that are defined by the libfabric API. So the API is a definition of the service that the application can expect to receive from the provider. The question is, does the provider deliver that service as promised? So now we're into the realm of compliance and less into the realm of interoperability. The question comes up, compliance to what? There's no specification for the libfabric API. We're in sort of uncharted territory there. We developed an API based on consumer requirements, not based on an existing specification. As Verbs is. Verbs is based on the InfiniBand architecture, where the semantic behavior of the API is defined in the InfiniBand spec. There is no such spec in that case. So the question becomes compliance to what? And I think the best answer we have so far, and this is an area for further research and consideration and discussion, the best example we have so far is the man pages. So to the extent that the man pages define the way that the API is intended to work, we can conceive of the notion of trying to test a particular provider to say, does it in fact do what it says it was going to do? Plus or minus the fact that, as Sean pointed out, there is a large choice of features available, whether you implement a particular endpoint type or a particular set of features. But for any one set of features or endpoint types that you claim to support, you can imagine a case where you could test a provider to say, does it conform to the APIs defined by the man pages? So if we're successful in doing this, what happens now is the consumer becomes portable. So you write a consumer application, and by consumer, when I say that, to be clear, what I mean is whoever it is who's consuming network services. It could be an application that's written straight to the network API, or more likely it's middleware like MPI or MPitch or something like that, that itself consumes network services. But if you're successful in doing this, saying that you know what the provider provides, and it provides something consistent with the API, all of a sudden the consumer now becomes portable. This is that notion of transport neutrality or transport agnosticity I talked about. Once I've coded the application for OFI, in theory, I can port it to some other implementation, some other provider, should work just as well. Again, plus or minus the fact that there's lots of choices about what providers provide in terms of their feature set. So that's where I think we're trying to head here, moving a little bit away from the notion of interoperability. I shouldn't say away from, I should say expanding our thinking beyond simple interoperability testing to include this notion of compliance. Just to give you an example, this is something I grabbed off the OFI GitHub wiki. It's a matrix that shows, or a piece of a matrix that shows the existing providers today and what they do and don't provide. So if we were to go down a path like this, it would have to be driven by a matrix like this, which is built into the GitHub repository maintained by the vendors. So if you claim support for a particular endpoint type and a particular set of features, we should be able to hold you accountable for, does your implementation really do that? Okay, so the question really became that I started with, how can the OpenFabrics Alliance begin to deliver more value based on where we're taking OFI going forward than we are today? And the question I'm asking is, can we expand the Interop program in some way so that it delivers more value further up the stack? Not to ignore the hardware vendors, bread and butter, heart and soul. This is an expansion, not a replacement. So what kind of a program can we come up with that will take us to the next level up? So I made up what I thought was, I'm a hardware guy. You might ask what I'm doing talking about software, and I ask myself that question all the time. But I made up my idea of what a software development cycle would look like. In stage one, there's a couple of people sitting around doing architecture, and they're asking themselves big picture questions. And the one that I picked on was, what API should I target with my implementation that I'm eventually going to come up with? And I picked on OFI in particular. So should I implement OFI? That's a sort of an architecturally kind of question that gets asked. And then having sort of made the big picture architectural questions, the next question is, well, now what? Okay, so I'm going to do something different. How do I do this different thing? I'm convinced that, for example, OFI is the great answer, but it's hard to do and it's different from what I'm used to, and I don't know how to do it. By the way, the OFA faced this exact same question with the emergence of verbs. Those who were around 10 or 12 or 15 years ago, if you stop and think about it, this verbs thing emerged. Wow, this is the greatest thing ever. Nobody knew how to code to it. And that stumped everybody for a good long time. And it wasn't until 2011 or so that the notion of, let's develop training to help people figure it out came up. So the second step is, okay, I've made this bold decision and now I'm going to have to live with it. Third step is I'm going to actually develop code. So I got people who are trying to bang out code and they're not really sure how I implement this feature or how I call that function and what happens when I do it, and I'm a little confused about that. But I finally muddle through that and I get some code, but I need to test and validate and deploy it and make sure it's workable before I ship it. And beyond that, once I've done that, I'm going to want to maintain the thing and maybe add new features as time goes on. So that's kind of my rough idea about the way that product development in the software world goes along. Whether I'm right or wrong isn't really relevant, as you're going to see in just a minute. Of course, much of what I say isn't terribly relevant. But so where are places that the OFA could add some value in that chain? The first place was in architecture. Should I deploy OFI? What would be helpful here would be some expert guidance. But at this point, you as a code developer or as an architect probably haven't made a decision about, do I want to go with OFI or not? And even more to the point, you haven't selected a vendor. What we said is, we're trying to be transport agnostic, and what you don't want is to be locked into the decision right now to go to a particular vendor and say, teach me about your provider because I'm going to code to that. You want to be able to preserve this notion of application transportability, so you do not want to be talking to, at this point, a provider vendor. You would like some neutral guidance about that. The next question, how do I code to OFI? Well, training. This is where we can provide sort of training, which we've done before. Dr. Russell developed a wonderful course for how do you code to RDMA. I can imagine that something like how do you code to OFI might be helpful for people trying to figure it out going forward. The third part, code development. I can imagine there, at this point, there's a test bed available. There's certain things that you want to try out. You have just about outgrown the sockets provider as your code development vehicle. You want to start running with a real provider. Maybe you even want to try running it on real hardware. You may or may not have that in-house. And the next is design, test, validation, and deployment. In that case, it would be really nice to be able to run your stuff on a neutral third-party kind of a cluster to see if it really works. So there's lots of places here where we could provide value add. These are just examples to illustrate the point. So here's the proposal that we're sort of working towards. It's an informal proposal. If people in this room stand up and start cheering and say this is the greatest thing ever, then we'll be heartened to take an informal proposal and try to turn it into a more formal proposal, hammer on it some more with our, lots of meetings and lots of discussion, and eventually take it to the OpenFabrics Alliance board and say we think this is something worth pursuing. Not at that point yet. Looking for feedback from this audience if we should be. But the basic idea was, rather than paste training on at the very end, let's integrate that with part of our value add development chain proposal right up at the beginning. Let's do that now, not wait until we're 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years down the road to do that. Let's talk about providing some sort of provider compliance validation. So I talked before about this notion of being able to verify that a given provider really conforms to the API as defined by the man pages. Support for consumer code development. So I'm talking here about maybe there's development environments that would be useful. Maybe there are scripts or tools or tricks that you can use. Access to expert developers, experts in OFI and/or experts in a given provider. Generally speaking, people who are writing code don't want to be network experts. They're forced to be because they have to. Maybe we can alleviate some of that by providing access to some expertise. Validation, tuning, and optimization, we talked about that. Maybe assistance in deploying and implementation. What exactly that would look like? Not clear. I'm being ambiguous about this. We need to figure this out if there's value here in doing that. Same thing is true with this last bullet, testing at scale. This is an unsolved problem. No one's ever been able to solve it before. But it makes me wonder, some vendors out there, Cray is one, periodically have access to very, very large scale machines for periods of time when we can do some scale testing. Some of our customers allow us to do that periodically. Are there things that we might want to do that the OFA might want to do to support that kind of in the field testing? There's no way that we're going to build a supercomputer cluster at UNH. Don't misunderstand me. But for people who want to consume this stuff, who are trying to do this kind of testing, are there things that the OFA can contribute to that to support and enable that? So what's emerging here is this notion of a sort of a center of excellence in networking. Happily, Bob Noseworthy from the UNH-IOL is not on the phone because I just changed his charter. I don't know how he feels about that. He's not yelled at me yet when we said things like that, but he may as time goes on. But the idea would be that, you know, the OFA, we are the people in the world who know the most about high-performance networking. And can we find a way to bring that expertise and make it available to people who want to consume or develop high-performance networking? That's where we're going with all this. So the OFA is, I believe, in a position to add value simply because we are the collection of experts in the world. What we have right now, excellent program, very well recognized, very highly regarded, sort of worldwide. Let's expand and grow on that base that we have now. Not throw it away, let's add to it, let's grow it, and let's expand it. And to get involved in this, as I said, the little 3 steering committee people have been having these sort of informal meetings and came up with this giant brain eruption. The question now is we need to take this into the Interoperability Working Group and see if we can convince that group that this makes sense. And I'm going to encourage people in this room who may have an interest in joining that group and participating. And you can hound Paul Bowden about how you do that. If we learn from history, we are in a position to do things much earlier than we've done in the past. Coming along with training 3 or 5 or 8 years after the fact doesn't work. You've got to do it now. That's the sort of thing that we're thinking about. So call to action, go to the OpenFabrics website, get hooked in, buzz Paul, whatever works for you. Questions? I know I'm holding you up for lunch. Actually, we're 15 minutes early, so life is good.
I'll ask a question. So I was going to ask earlier, what about UNH? But then you finally mentioned it on the second to last slide. Are you supplanting or replacing or taking over the UNH charter, the IOL charter? I mean, what's the relationship you're proposing here?
Well, I'm not proposing anything with respect to a specific. I picked on UNH IOL because we have an existing relationship with them for the Interop program.
Yeah,
if the OFA chose to do something like this, we would be looking for a vendor, and the first people we would go ask would be UNH IOL.
Okay. Okay, good. And I will support your call to action by observing that there are an increasing number of RDMA vendors appearing, many of whom are actually implementing the same protocols. So I think the interop problem in RDMA is going to expand greatly in the next couple of years.
That's true.
And so having a program in place that enables this for good success in the market so that it doesn't fragment the market and confuse the customers will be extremely important.
Early. The key is to do it early.
It should already be in place, right? The sooner the better.
And we learned this, again, with our experiences with RDMA and verbs. We learned this over the past. Let's apply those learnings now
Right.
that we're expanding our scope.
And your mention of network fabrics, the switches are part of this, particularly in Rocky space. And so it's really quite a broad spectrum of the networking industry. I'm not sure OFA is up to it, frankly. I think you may need a larger organization.
Could be. Let's find
Okay.
out. I'm willing to give it a shot and see what happens. But if we don't ask, we won't ever know. Any other comments, suggestions, brickbats?
So it's a number of the, or at least a few of the fabric, well-established fabrics have an organization which does some testing within their organization. Is there a way to coordinate so that we're not overlapping the work? I know the IBTA has a pretty extensive program, and it'd be interesting to see if we can coordinate it so we're not duplicating effort that might be, like, if you want to know if IBTA, if an InfiniBand HCA interops with another one, the InfiniBand Trade Association might be able to do that really well.
So I would not suggest that. What I'm suggesting here about an expansion of focus beyond interoperability to include compliance testing, we would continue to do, at least the way I see it, exactly what we're doing today for the InfiniBand, iWarp, and Rocky marketplaces, which is an interop program based on products that vouch for their compliance by their governing standards body, like the IBTA. So we do that today. So an HCA gets validated for compliance to the InfiniBand spec by the IBTA. What we do in the OFA is we add interoperability to that. The only point I'm making is you start talking about OpenFabrics as interfaces and so on, which is transport agnostic. The notion of interoperability no longer makes a lot of sense. So where do we add value? And the answer is we add value in the compliance space simply because there's nobody else to do it. There is no standards body that drove the development of the OFI APIs.
So I'm assuming you're also thinking that compliance should happen for the verbs interfaces.
No, I
No?
believe that belongs to the IBTA today. It does today, and it should continue to.
Because I know people who have struggled with getting portable software to work between iWarp and Rocky and InfiniBand because they're not a 100% overlap. So I'm just wondering, it seems curious that we won't kind of pursue that also.
Yeah, so let me back up a little bit. You're right. You're right. Again, what motivated my thinking in this was the emergence of the transport agnosticity notion in OpenFabrics interfaces. If there are things that we can do to expand the existing interop program, by all means, let's do that too. Absolutely. Anything else? Looks like we get 15 minutes early lunch. This is a good thing. Thank you very much.